In the shadowy halls of the University of Utrecht, a fierce battle was brewing. It was a battle not of swords and shields, but of ideas and words. At the center of this conflict was a man named Gijsbert Voetius, a towering figure in the Dutch Reformed Church. Voetius was a man of immense learning and unwavering faith, but he was also a fierce defender of orthodoxy, ready to do whatever it took to protect the purity of the Reformed faith. The year was 1639, and a new and dangerous idea was spreading through the halls of Utrecht. It was the philosophy of René Descartes, a French thinker who dared to question everything, even the most sacred beliefs. Descartes' ideas were like a wildfire, spreading quickly among the students and faculty. They challenged the traditional views of the world, the nature of God, and even the authority of the Bible itself. Voetius was alarmed. He saw Cartesianism as a threat to the very foundations of the Reformed faith. He knew that if these ideas were allowed to flourish, they could undermine the authority of the Bible and the Church. So, he took action. He gathered his most loyal students and began to prepare a defense against the Cartesian heresy. One of Voetius' students, a young and ambitious theologian, stood up in a crowded lecture hall and delivered a powerful speech. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we must stand firm against the atheistic ideas of Descartes. His philosophy is a poison that will destroy our faith and our society. We must defend the truth of the Bible and the teachings of our church." The audience was electrified. Some cheered, while others looked on with concern. The Cartesian professors in the hall were not pleased. They saw Voetius and his followers as narrow-minded and intolerant, standing in the way of progress and enlightenment. The debate raged on, spilling out of the university and into the streets of Utrecht. Pamphlets and treatises flew back and forth, each side trying to outdo the other in their arguments. The city was divided, and the tension was palpable. But the battle over Cartesianism was just one part of a larger struggle. The study of the Bible itself was undergoing a transformation. For centuries, the Bible had been the ultimate authority, a sacred text that was believed to be the literal Word of God. But now, a new generation of scholars was beginning to question this view. In the Netherlands, men like Joseph Scaliger and Isaac Casaubon were using their knowledge of ancient languages to study the Bible in a new way. They were comparing different translations, examining historical sources, and even challenging long-held beliefs about the authorship of certain books. For example, they began to question whether Moses had really written the first 5 books of the Old Testament. This new approach to biblical scholarship was not limited to the Netherlands. In France, at the Huguenot Academy of Saumur, a man named Louis Cappel was making waves. Cappel taught Hebrew and was known for his deep knowledge of the biblical languages. He wrote a book called The Secrets of the Vowel Points Revealed, in which he argued that the vowel points in the Hebrew text were not part of the original language, but were added much later. This was a radical idea, and it caused a stir among the scholarly community. Cappel's work was just the beginning. He went on to write a more comprehensive book, the Critica Sacra, which delved deeper into the problems of biblical interpretation. He suggested that the text of the Bible could be corrected using other early translations and even non-biblical texts. This idea was so controversial that the book could not be published until years after it was written. The implications of these new approaches were profound. They suggested that the understanding of the Bible was not fixed and unchanging, but could evolve over time. This was a challenge to the traditional view that the Bible was a perfect and inerrant text, and it threatened to undermine the authority of the Church. Voetius and his followers were not the only ones who were concerned. Catholic scholars, too, were interested in these new methods of biblical study. They saw an opportunity to challenge the Protestant interpretation of the Bible and to argue that the text was too complex to be understood without the guidance of the Church. The battle lines were drawn. On one side were the traditionalists, like Voetius, who believed in the literal inerrancy of the Bible and the need to defend the Reformed faith against all challenges. On the other side were the Reformers, like Cappel, who saw the study of the Bible as a dynamic and evolving process, one that required the use of the best available tools and methods. The stakes were high. This was not just a debate about academic theories. It was a battle for the soul of the Reformed faith. The outcome would shape the way people understood the Bible and their relationship to God for generations to come. In the meantime, the conflict between Voetius and the Cartesians continued to intensify. The Cartesian ideas spread to other universities, including Leiden, where they found new supporters. The debate over the authority of the Bible and the nature of truth was far from over, and the future of the Reformed faith hung in the balance. In the later decades of the 17th century, the world of theology was undergoing significant changes. Scholars and thinkers were beginning to question traditional beliefs about the Bible and its authority. This shift was partly due to the rise of historical criticism, a method that involved examining the Bible as a historical document rather than as a divine, infallible text. Some of the most daring critics of the time included remonstrants like Hugo Grotius, Simon Episcopius, and Jean de Courcelles, who used these new methods to challenge the authorship of various books in the Old Testament. They were followed by even more radical thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, Baruch Spinoza, and Richard Simon, who pushed the boundaries even further. These new approaches to the Bible posed a serious challenge to the defenders of Orthodox Christianity. Reformed churchmen, who were committed to maintaining traditional doctrines, had to find ways to respond. While some, like Louis Cappel, saw the value in using historical and critical methods to understand the Bible, they were careful not to go as far as the more radical critics. Cappel, for example, still defended the idea that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, and he and his colleagues at the Academy of Saumur wrote rebuttals to the Remonstrant Catechism and the Socinians. They remained within the traditions of Reformed doctrine, even as they adopted more critical approaches to biblical study. However, even within the mainstream of Reformed thought, the adoption of historical and critical methods began to change how people viewed the Bible. The old belief that the events, prophecies, and institutions of the Old Testament were directly applicable to contemporary times began to wane. For example, earlier Reformed thinkers, like John Calvin and Theodore Beza, saw the kings of Israel and the prophets as models for Christian rulers and leaders. They believed that the political wisdom found in the Old Testament was as relevant as the truths of mathematics. But as scholars like Cappel and his colleague Moïse Miraut began to apply historical criticism, they saw a greater distance between ancient Israel and modern Europe. The institutions and practices of ancient Israel no longer seemed as normative for the Christian Church. This shift had significant implications for political thought. Miraut, for instance, argued that government was not a divinely ordained institution whose primary role was to protect and promote true religion. Instead, he saw government as a human creation aimed at purely human goals. This view allowed for greater religious tolerance, as it suggested that a Christian ruler could allow multiple religions to coexist. This was a significant departure from the earlier Reformed belief that rulers had a duty to enforce true religion and punish heretics. The rise of Cartesian philosophy and the new methods of biblical criticism also brought new questions to the forefront of theological discussions. The old debates about predestination became less urgent, while questions about the authority of Scripture and the extent to which Old Testament laws applied to Christians became more important. Both Cartesian philosophy, with its emphasis on systematic doubts and clear reasoning, and historical criticism, with its focus on the critical examination of biblical texts, elevated the role of reason in Christian thought. The scientific advancements of the 17th century further reinforced the importance of reason. In this context, theologians were forced to grapple with how much of Christianity was truly compatible with reason and how to demonstrate the truth of Christianity to a growing number of unbelievers. Some theologians clung to traditional orthodoxy, while others embraced new, more rational approaches to theology. The specific issues and debates varied across different regions. In the Low Countries, the conflict centered around the ideas of Johannes Cocasius, a prominent theologian whose views on the covenant and the interpretation of the Bible challenged the literal inerrancy of the Bible and echoed Cartesian ideas. This led to a long-standing divide within the Dutch Reformed Church, with Cocasius supporters and opponents clashing for 2 generations. In England, the political and religious turmoil of the mid-17th century led to the emergence of various competing churches and theological tendencies. This environment encouraged the development of rational theology, which sought to unite believers through reason. This approach gained strength in the English Church, particularly after the Glorious Revolution, and opened the door to more radical forms of theological rationalism, such as deism and anti-Trinitarianism. In Switzerland and France, the debates were influenced by both Cartesian and Salmurian, from Saumur tendencies. Initially, predestinarian theology and scriptural literalism dominated, but by the end of the century, rational theology was gaining ground, forcing orthodoxy to retreat. Johannes Cocasius, a key figure in these debates, was a learned Hebraist and systematic theologian. He developed a form of covenant theology that downplayed the importance of predestination and emphasized the progressive unfolding of God's plan through history. Cocasius's approach to the Bible stressed the need for exegesis that stayed close to the text and avoided unnecessary philosophical terminology. He saw the covenant of grace as having 2 economies, one established with Abraham and his descendants, and the other revealed more fully through Christ and the New Testament. Cocasius's theology also included allegorical and typological readings of the Old Testament, which he saw as prefiguring Christ. Cocasius's ideas, while not explicitly contradictory to the confessional documents of the Dutch Church, were still controversial. His criticism of scholastic terminology and his allegorical readings of Scripture were seen as deviations from the literal sense of the Bible. The strictest defenders of orthodoxy, led by Gijsbert Voetius, saw Cocasius's ideas as a threat. The conflict between the Voetians and the Cocasians, which began over the issue of the Sabbath, lasted for more than half a century. The secular authorities often had to intervene to prevent the disputes from becoming more severe. Despite the intense conflicts, the Dutch Church managed to avoid a full schism. Ministers in Amsterdam worked out an agreement to recognize their shared core beliefs and to seek out future ministers who were moderate and peaceful. This approach helped to contain the conflicts, though disagreements between the 2 camps persisted for many years. In other parts of Europe, similar conflicts between Cocasians and anti-Cocasians emerged, particularly in German Reformed territories and Hungary. However, in France and England, Cocasius's ideas were less influential, and the debates took different forms. In England, the rise of rational theology was more pronounced. The political and religious fragmentation of the mid-17th century created an environment where antidogmatic forms of theology gained traction. These approaches sought to unite believers through reason and were seen as a counter to the perceived atheistic implications of the new philosophy. This rational theology eventually gave way to more radical forms, such as deism and anti-Trinitarianism, which dominated theological debates by the end of the century. In Switzerland and France, the debates were influenced by both Cartesian and Salmurian tendencies. Initially, Predestinarian theology and scriptural literalism dominated. But by the end of the century, rational theology was gaining ground, forcing orthodoxy to retreat. The theological landscape of the late 17th century was thus marked by a shift towards more rational and critical approaches to the Bible and Christian doctrine. These changes reflected broader intellectual and cultural shifts of the time, as reason and historical criticism played increasingly important roles in shaping religious thought. The England of the 1650s was a place of great turmoil. Over the past decade, 2 civil wars had been fought, and King Charles I had been executed, leading to the abolition of the monarchy. The established church, the Church of England, had also fragmented. Different groups, like Episcopalians, Presbyterians, and Congregationalists, argued fiercely about how the church should be governed. Preachers and writers spread a wide range of ideas without fear of censorship. Some believed the end of the world was near, while others, like the Quakers, emphasized the direct guidance of the Holy Spirit. Prominent clergymen often compared current events to stories from the Old Testament, sometimes with disastrous results. Many people left their parish churches to form their own congregations. Amid this chaos, new ideas were gaining traction. René Descartes' works, which emphasized rational thinking, began to influence university students. Thomas Hobbes, a philosopher, wrote Leviathan in 1651, arguing for a strong central authority to maintain order. He believed that natural law, the basic rules of right and wrong, was rooted in the instinct for self-preservation. However, his ideas were seen as dangerously close to atheism because he denied the separation between the material and spiritual worlds. Young theologians, disturbed by the divisions and the spread of what they saw as dangerous ideas, sought a way to bring the church back together. They longed for a faith that was both rational and unifying. One of these young theologians was William Chillingworth. Born in 1602, Chillingworth had a journey that led him to question the nature of faith. He converted to Catholicism in 1628, hoping for Christian unity, but soon realized that the Catholic Church was not as accepting as he had hoped. He returned to England and, after much reflection, converted back to the Church of England. In 1637, he wrote, "The Religion of Protestants a Safe Way to Salvation," where he argued that reason should be the basis of faith. He believed that the Bible could be understood rationally, and that God expected people to seek the truth with their minds. During the Civil War and the period without a king, the interregnum, a group of university teachers, including Benjamin Whichcote, Henry Moore, John Wilkins, and Ralph Cudworth, began to blend philosophy and theology. They aimed to create a version of Christianity that all reasonable people could accept. These men, known as the Cambridge Platonists, believed that God's design was evident in the natural world, and that the human mind was capable of understanding moral truths. They argued that while some aspects of faith, like the Trinity, were beyond reason, it was still rational to believe in the Bible because of its reliable historical accounts and the miracles it described. Their students, such as Simon Patrick, John Tillotson, Edward Stillingfleet, and Thomas Tennyson, continued their work. These latitude men, a term meaning they were broad-minded, believed that the core of Christianity was its moral teachings, which aligned closely with natural reason. They saw the Bible as a source of moral guidance rather than a collection of complex doctrines. They also drew on ancient philosophers like Cicero, Seneca, and Plato to support their ideas. One of the most influential of these thinkers was Edward Stillingfleet. In 1659, he wrote, "Irenicum, a weapon salve for the churches," wounds where he argued that the form of church government was less important than the unity of the church. He believed that as long as a church promoted peace and followed basic moral principles, it was valid. He also wrote Origenes Sacrae, or a rational account of the grounds of the Christian faith in 1662, where he defended the Bible's historical reliability and the plausibility of its miracles. Stillingfleet's work was part of a broader movement that aimed to make Christianity more accessible and rational. However, as the century progressed, this approach faced challenges. Philosophers like Baruch Spinoza and biblical critics like Richard Simon questioned the reliability of the Bible and the rationality of certain doctrines, such as the Trinity. These challenges led to a growing debate about the nature of faith and reason. In 1687, Stephen Nye published a brief history of the Unitarians, called also Socinians, which sparked a heated debate about the Trinity. In 1693, Charles Blount's The Oracles of Reason promoted a natural religion without a role for Christ, John Toland's Christianity, not mysterious. In 1695, argued that Christian teachings should not contradict reason. John Locke, a friend of many latitudinarians, published The Reasonableness of Christianity in 1695, simplifying the core of Christian belief to the idea that Jesus was the Messiah and that believers should repent and obey. These ideas marked a shift in how people thought about religion. The emphasis on reason and historical evidence challenged traditional beliefs and opened the door to new forms of religious thought. The debates of the 1650s and beyond shaped the way people understood faith and reason, influencing the development of modern religious and philosophical ideas. These views naturally alarmed Stillingfleet, and in the last years of his life he wrote a series of works to counter them. His book, Discourse in Vindication of the Doctrine of the Trinity, used lots of textual evidence to support the idea that key passages in the Bible about the Trinity were genuine. He also showed that the Trinity wasn't forced on people by the Church. Stillingfleet accepted that the vowel points in Hebrew weren't part of the original text, but he still believed that Moses wrote most of the Pentateuch. He also pointed out that some ancient manuscripts included 1 John chapter 5 verse 7, even though others didn't. Stillingfleet worked hard to defend the Church from people like Toland and Lockett, who said that the clergy made up mysteries and rituals to gain power. Despite his efforts, Unitarians, deists, freethinkers, and others who believed in a simpler form of Christianity still gained influence within the Church of England. However, many English people remained loyal to the idea of predestination and a more emotional approach to faith. They saw the more liberal thinkers as just moral men without the power of godliness. Even so, Stillingfleet's ideas and those of his supporters remained influential in English Protestantism for over a century after his death. One of his main sources was Beza, a key figure in Reformed Orthodoxy, even though Stillingfleet differed from Beza on some points, like predestination and the nature of faith. In Switzerland and its French-speaking regions, the main topics of theological debate were different. But rational theology also gained ground by the end of the century. Cartesian ideas didn't reach Swiss universities until the 1660s, and when they did, they caused a lot of tension. The Buxtorfs of Basel were key figures in the debate over biblical criticism, especially the issue of vowel points. In 1668, Bern banned the teaching of Cartesian ideas, and in 1669, Geneva required all ministers to sign a strict form of orthodoxy. This led to a conflict, as some ministers like Louis Tronchin and Philippe Mastrezat refused to sign. After much debate, they eventually signed for the sake of peace. The conflict in Geneva worried other Swiss Protestant cantons, so they sought a new creed. The ministers of Basel and Zurich led the effort, and in 1674, a meeting of the Protestant cantons agreed to draft a new document. The result was the Helvetic Consensus of 1675, which rejected the ideas of Amiraut and Cappel. It was adopted by most Protestant territories in the region, but Geneva was divided. It took several years for the document to be accepted, thanks to the efforts of François Turretini. However, within a generation, many of the territories that adopted the Helvetic Consensus abandoned it. In Geneva, Jean-Alphonse Turretini, the son of François Turretini, played a key role in this shift. After his father's death, Jean-Alphonse was influenced by Tronchin and Cartesian ideas. He traveled to Leiden, England, and Paris, where he met famous thinkers like Newton and Malebranche. He became a professor in Geneva and taught that reason was a valid source of knowledge about God and that theology should be based on rational thinking. His main work, Treatise of the Christian Religion, aimed to show that Reformed Christianity could be defended using rational arguments. He focused on fewer fundamental doctrines and didn't emphasize predestination. Another important figure was John Leclerc, who was influenced by Tronchin and Cartesian ideas at the Genevan Academy. To avoid signing the Helvetic Consensus, he took a job as a tutor and eventually fled to Holland. In Amsterdam, he wrote extensively on biblical criticism and attacked the ideas of predestination and the use of force against heretics. He also edited the works of Erasmus and Grotius, and his writings became very popular even in Geneva. Even conservative ministers like Benedict Pictet and Jean Frederick Oosterwald showed the changing theological climate. Pictet warned against quarrels over predestination and adopted a historical critical approach to the Bible. Oosterwald focused on moral issues and liturgical reform, and his catechism omitted the topic of predestination. These changes led to the decline of the high orthodoxy of the Helvetic Consensus. In 1706, Geneva and Basel removed the requirement for ministers to sign the document, and by 1725, it was completely repealed. The new theological atmosphere also brought changes to worship. In 1690, Geneva replaced its old Psalter with a new one that reflected the changes in French language and style. The city also began to observe holidays like Christmas and Ascension Day, which had been avoided in the past. In 1707, a Lutheran minister was allowed to hold services in Geneva, marking a significant shift from the strict policies of the past. These changes showed that the Reformed churches in Switzerland were moving away from the strict orthodoxy of the previous century and embracing a more rational and practical approach to faith and worship. In the years after the Reformation, when the dust of religious upheaval had settled, the Reformed and their non-Reformed neighbors found a way to live together, though not without tension. In France, for example, Reformed and Catholic neighbors often lived on the same streets, did business with each other, and even socialized. In a small town called Layrac, political rivalries didn't follow religious lines, meaning that Reformed and Catholics could be on the same side of a local dispute. However, marriages between different faiths were rare. When Reformed people in Oppenheim did marry outside their church, they were more likely to marry Lutherans than Catholics. Despite the everyday interactions, there was always an invisible border between the different faiths. Theologians and historians from both sides wrote extensively about the errors and crimes of the other faiths. Catechisms in areas with religious diversity often included pages dedicated to criticizing the beliefs of other religions. Churches discouraged their members from attending schools or ceremonies of other faiths. Public debates between religious leaders were common, but they rarely changed anyone's mind. Instead, they reinforced existing beliefs and highlighted the differences between the faiths. In an era where the state was expected to protect and promote the true church, religious leaders on all sides were quick to report any violations of the laws governing religious coexistence. Church assemblies often asked the authorities to reduce or eliminate the tolerance granted to other faiths. The tolerance that did exist was more about grudging acceptance of an unpleasant situation rather than a celebration of religious diversity. This atmosphere often led to violent clashes. In France, for example, there were small incidents of violence between Reformed and Catholics throughout the 17th century. Catholic crowds sometimes ransacked Protestant churches, and Huguenots, French Protestants, might throw stones at Catholic religious houses. In Poland, the Catholic population initially reacted passively to the spread of Protestantism, but after 1570, a new militancy arose. In 1574, the Reformed temple in Krakow was attacked, and the books were burned in a bonfire. Similar attacks happened in 1575, 1577, 1587, and 1591, with the final attack burning the temple to the ground. The Reformed churches in regions with a favorable political landscape grew stronger over time. In Brandenburg, Prussia, when Elector John Sigismund converted to the Reformed faith, he faced a largely Lutheran population. He started Reformed services only in the court, and initially, only a few noblemen joined him. Over time, more people joined to win the elector's favor. By the end of the century, Reformed services were held in about 20 cities, and the crowds were much larger. In the Netherlands, the Reformed Church became the legally privileged church in the 7 northern provinces that gained independence from Spain. However, only a small fraction of the population initially joined the church. Over the years, membership in local Reformed churches increased dramatically. By the mid-18th century, Reformed congregants made up about 36% of the adult population in Friesland, up from 12 to 28% in the early 17th century. The church's influence also grew in local politics. In Leiden, the percentage of city council members who had served as elders in the Reformed Church increased from 5 to 55% between 1574 and 1640. In Utrecht, the church and city government became closely intertwined. In Transylvania, the Reformed faith also gained strength under the rule of several energetic leaders who favored the Reformed cause. Gijsbert Voetius, a skilled military leader, took the throne in 1613 and became a zealous Calvinist. He founded an academy at Alba Julia and brought in prominent Reformed scholars. His successors, George I and I Rakoczy, continued to support the Reformed Church. They intervened in the 30 Years' War on the Protestant side and gained control of several border counties. The Reformed Church in Transylvania grew as a result of this support, while the number of anti-Trinitarian churches declined. To build up the leadership of the Reformed churches, Bethlen and other aristocratic protectors sent promising young men to study at prestigious Reformed universities in Western and Central Europe. Many of these students returned to their homeland and received important positions in the church. In both the Netherlands and Transylvania, students who had studied in England returned with ideas for further reforming their churches inspired by the Puritan movements in England. In the Netherlands, the movement for further reformation, known as the Nader Reformatie, was heavily influenced by Puritan ideas. Willem Teelink, a key figure in this movement, spent time in Banbury, England, and was inspired by the strict Sabbath observance and the moral discipline of the Puritans. He became a minister and wrote many edifying treatises. He and his colleagues pushed for stricter Sabbath observance, which became a major issue in the Dutch Church. Zeeland, a region closely tied to England, became a center for this movement, with its clergy advocating for stricter Sabbath laws. In both the Netherlands and Transylvania, the Reformed churches continued to grow and influence local politics, but the tension between different faiths remained a constant challenge. Despite the everyday interactions and the grudging tolerance, the invisible border between the Reformed and their neighbors never fully disappeared. In 1627, during a time of great struggle for Protestants in the 30 Years' War, and for the Dutch in their war against Spain, a man named Tilink wrote a book called Necessary Expostulation concerning the present lamentable state of God's people. In this book, he listed many sins and problems he saw in Dutch society, like people not being as devout as they used to be, celebrating heathen holidays, and not paying attention during church on Sundays. Some of his complaints were unique to the Dutch, such as people only coming to church to have their children baptized. Others showed Puritan influence, like calling for stricter Sunday observance and a national covenant. Tilink's book was part of a larger effort by church leaders to convince the government to enforce stricter religious laws. They wanted to stop things like Sunday dancing and the tolerance of Catholics and Jews. This kind of agitation continued throughout the century. In the 1650s and 1660s, a group led by Voetius in Utrecht tried to close theaters, enforce stricter Sabbath rules, and use church funds for pious purposes. After the French invasion in 1672, other clergymen like Herman Witsius and Jacobus Colman called for a national covenant and attacked practices like formulary prayers, urging a general renewal of morals and piety. However, the reception of these calls for reform was mixed. In Zeeland, the practical preachers gained a reputation for godliness. In Holland, many people opposed too much church oversight, and the poet Joost van den Vando wrote verses against the seditious seed of the Tilinks. In Utrecht, Voetius and his allies had some successes, like convincing some members of the chapter to give up their prebends and getting a ban on theater performances. But they also faced backlash. 2 ministers, including Tilink's son Johannes, lost their jobs and were banished for criticizing the use of former church property. Another minister, Colman, was removed from his post in Sluis in 1675 for rejecting formulary prayers. Overall, the Dutch government was more concerned with keeping clergymen from causing trouble than with enforcing strict religious laws. In Transylvania and Hungary, the movement for further reformation had a different trajectory. In 1610, a Transylvanian who had studied in England and the Netherlands returned to Gijsbert and urged the synod to establish lay elders and equal treatment for ministers. He was quickly removed from his post and banished. Later, in the 1630s and 1640s, a group of Hungarian students in London vowed to restore the purity of the Christian Church and eliminate improper hierarchy. When they returned home, they faced resistance. The Debrecen Synod required them to accept traditional practices and to seek changes only through official channels. One of the leaders, Janos Tolnai Dali, was appointed to teach at the Academy of Saros Patak, but got into trouble for opposing practices like baptizing sick infants outside of regular church services and elevating the communion wafer. He was suspended from his post, but found support from the powerful Rakoczy family, who made him a minister and archdeacon. This led to a split among the clergy, and the ruling prince had to intervene. In 1646, a national synod was held, which upheld traditional practices and required students returning from abroad to promise not to teach Anabaptism, Socinianism, Puritanism, or Arminianism. Another Transylvanian, Pau Medjisi, continued the struggle for further reformation. His 1650 political ecclesiastical dialogue called for a Presbyterian synodal church order. He was forced to leave Transylvania, but found support from Susanna Laurentfi in the neighboring counties. His proposals gained some traction in the regions governed by her favored younger son, and a presbyterial system of church governance was established in a few areas. However, the movement faced strong opposition, and the town of Maros Vesarli, when asked about the presbyterial religion, responded that they did not understand it and did not want it. In the Transdanubian church district, where the church operated independently of the political authorities, a call for lay elders and a consistorial body to aid in church discipline gained more traction. The Synod of Papa accepted this proposal in 1630, and a board of elders was established. This system helped with church discipline, oversaw schools, and reviewed clerical performance. Janos Kanizai Palfi, a leading advocate, was driven from the region by Catholic nobles, but succeeded in establishing presbyteries in the villages of Komarom, which lasted for at least 20 years. The movement for further reformation in Transylvania and Hungary faced significant challenges, especially when the political situation became unstable. In 1655, George II, Rákóczi's intervention in the Swedish-Polish War led to Ottoman punishment and the installation of a weak ruler, Michael I Apafi. This marked the beginning of increased subordination to outside control, culminating in the re-establishment of Habsburg protection in 1683. The principal figures in the Hungarian Puritan movement died around this time, and the Reformed churches in Transylvania were forced to become defensive. In Poland, the Reformed churches faced a different kind of erosion. Under Catholic kings, who encouraged conversions, many Protestant nobles returned to the Catholic Church. King Sigismund III, 1587–1632, favored Catholics for high office, and the establishment of prestigious Jesuit schools helped win back the social elites. By the end of Sigismund's reign, only a few senators were Protestant. Noblemen who converted could legally end Protestant worship on their lands, and Catholic clergy often tried to reclaim former Catholic churches. In cities, legal sanctions were imposed on Protestant citizens, and some cities banned their settlement. For example, in Krakow, the town hall was renovated in 1611 to reflect the changing religious climate, replacing Protestant symbols with Catholic ones. By the mid-17th century, only 40 Reformed churches remained in Little Poland, compared to 265 in the 1570s. In Lithuania, the Reformed cause remained strong for a while, even expanding in some border regions. However, the Second Northern War, 1655–60, dealt a severe blow to Protestantism, with only 45 of the 140 Reformed churches in Lithuania surviving. Protestants were accused of supporting the Swedish invasion, leading to new legal restrictions. In 1658, anti-Trinitarianism was outlawed, and adherents were given 2 years to convert or leave the country. This completed the scattering of the leading Polish Socinians, whose ideas spread to advanced circles in Holland and England. In France and Habsburg Hungary, the Reformed churches also faced significant challenges. Catholic kings imposed restrictions on their civil rights and privileges, and the need to defend their legal status made them less prone to internal divisions. The ebb in Reformed strength was most pronounced in Poland, where the movement had always been heavily dependent on aristocratic support. By the mid-17th century, the Reformed churches in these regions were on the defensive, struggling to maintain their presence amidst growing Catholic influence. In the wake of the Second Northern War, life for Protestants in Poland became much harder. A law from 1668 made it illegal for anyone to convert to Protestantism, and if they did, they could be banished. Protestant worship was also banned in the presence of the royal court or during important gatherings. By 1700, this law was understood to mean that noblemen couldn't attend Protestant services unless they were at their own home congregation. Another law from 1632, which originally stopped non-Catholic churches from being built in royal towns, was expanded to cover all towns. This law was also interpreted to mean that existing Protestant churches couldn't be repaired. In one case, a Reformed minister was tried and convicted for celebrating the Lord's Supper in a place other than a church that existed in 1632, even though the church had been destroyed by a Catholic mob in 1628, and the congregation had been meeting in a nearby manor house. These harsh laws caused Polish Protestantism to decline sharply. By the middle of the 18th century, only about 60 Reformed churches were still functioning in Poland, Lithuania, and the cities of Royal Prussia. In Hungary, which was under Habsburg control, the situation was different, but still challenging for Protestants. Rudolf II's attempt to force Catholicism on the population backfired and led to the Treaty of Vienna in 1606, which recognized Protestant rights of worship. This treaty marked the beginning of a closer relationship between the Habsburgs and militant Catholicism, known as Pietas Austriaca. In the Habsburg-ruled parts of Hungary, kings like Sigismund III in Poland made loyalty to Catholicism a key to getting important positions. They also tried to reduce Protestant worship and restrict Protestant rights using military force. Many of the greatest aristocratic supporters of the Reformed Church in Hungary were won back to Catholicism. However, in Hungary, the movement of spontaneous conversions among both clergymen and entire communities helped Protestantism defend itself more strongly and suffer less numerical decline. Ferdinand II, 1619 to 1637, and Ferdinand III, 1637 to 1657, were strong supporters of Catholicism, but the 30 Years' War kept them busy and they couldn't focus much on Hungarian affairs. The task of promoting the Counter-Reformation in Hungary fell to Peter Pavani, the Archbishop of Esztergom. Pavani, a former Reformed believer who converted to Catholicism, worked hard to introduce Catholic reforms, founded Jesuit seminaries, and a new Catholic university. He wrote many books in the local language to persuade members of the leading aristocratic families to return to Catholicism. Pavani promised to help those who converted, and he managed to win back about 30 leading nobles to the Catholic Church. These nobles then forced Protestant ministers to leave their lands and closed down Protestant churches. Despite efforts by the Diet to protect the rights of peasants to worship as they chose, many churches were seized and closed, and Protestants were excluded from guilds and forced to observe Catholic holidays. During Leopold I's long reign, 1658 to 1705, the Habsburg government had more freedom to eliminate Protestantism. After a conspiracy of magnates was suppressed in 1670, the emperor took the opportunity to try to remake Hungary's constitution and religious makeup. Leopold's forces, led by the Bishop of Wiener Neustadt, Leopold Kolonich, took back many churches for the Catholics. A special tribunal, headed by the Archbishop of Esztergom, condemned 750 Protestant ministers and teachers for allegedly supporting a rebellion and praying for Turkish victory. Those who converted or renounced their faith were set free, but those who resisted were imprisoned or sent to the galleys. The forced march of 40 of these resistors to Naples, and their suffering on the galley benches became a symbol of Protestant martyrdom in Europe. The Hungarian nobility, always protective of their rights, rebelled against this assault on their religious and constitutional liberties. Under the leadership of Imre Thököly, about 2,000 men took to the mountains of Szlógia. They were joined by their Transylvanian cousins and the anti-Habsburg French, and the conflict escalated into a full-blown religious war. Thököly closed Catholic religious houses and seized churches for the Protestants, while the imperial forces, led by Archbishop György Szelepszényi, ended Protestant worship wherever they went. Despite the execution of 18 Protestant pastors, the rebels eventually won. In 1681, Leopold had to recognize the traditional liberties of the Hungarian nation and the rights of nobles and garrison soldiers to freedom of worship. The agreement also ordered that the status quo as of 1670 be restored, although many seized churches were never returned. Protestants were allowed to build one new church per county, but Leopold continued to try to limit Protestant rights of worship. After the Habsburgs reconquered parts of Hungary from the Turks in 1682 to 1686, new offenses restricted Protestant worship to specific localities and banned it in newly reconquered regions. By 1700, Hungary's Protestants retained some rights of worship, but far fewer than they had at the beginning of the 17th century. Many churches had been closed, and the Reformed Church had about 1,500 churches and made up about 33% of Hungary's population, down from 40 to 45% in 1600. Despite the loss of many high aristocrats to Catholicism, the Reformed Church remained a significant part of Hungary's population and played a crucial role in the development of Hungarian nationalism in the 19th century. In France, the fate of the Reformed churches in the 17th century can be divided into two periods, before and after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. Under the Edict of Nantes, French Protestants, known as Huguenots, faced fewer problems than their Hungarian counterparts, but their privileges were still eroded over time. Many Huguenot families were pressured to convert to Catholicism, especially if they wanted high office or military commands. The early kings of the 17th century were committed to upholding the Edict of Nantes. But the Catholic Reformation gained strength in France, and the clergy often called for stricter actions against the Huguenots. The Huguenots, who had learned from the wars of religion that they needed to be militant to preserve their rights, became more aggressive in defending their faith. In 1620, the young and pious Louis XIII insisted on restoring Catholicism in Bern and led a military campaign to enforce his will. This action made the Huguenots fear a wider plan to undermine their faith across France. They convened an assembly in La Rochelle which revived the military circles and aristocratic protectors used during the wars of religion. Louis XIII declared this an act of lèse-majesté and ordered the Huguenots to renounce the actions of the La Rochelle Assembly. Many northern Huguenots complied, but many towns in the south and west refused. Louis XIII responded with a series of military campaigns between 1621 and 1629, culminating in the successful siege of La Rochelle, which lasted 400 days. The Peace of Alais in 1629 confirmed the Huguenots' rights of worship under the Edict of Nantes, but took away their military privileges. After disarming the Huguenots, Louis XIII, Cardinal Richelieu, and later Cardinal Mazarin focused on winning over Huguenot noblemen with promises of pensions and military commands. This strategy worked, and many of the great Huguenot families returned to Catholicism. For example, Henry II de Condé, who was raised as a Catholic but born into a Protestant family, became an ardent persecutor of Huguenots and ended Reformed worship in several of his fiefs, including the county of Sancerre in 1640. However, the case of Sancerre also shows the limits of seigneurial influence. When Condé shut down the church in Sancerre and shifted 80% of the town's tax burden onto the Huguenots, the town's Protestant population, which had about 2,000 members, suffered. During the Fronde Revolt, the Huguenots helped keep the city loyal to Mazarin and Anne of Austria, and they were rewarded with a royal decree allowing them to reopen their church. After a decade of persecution and heavy taxes, the church that resumed worship still had about 1,200 members. The Huguenots' loyalty to the king during the Fronde led many of their political thinkers to become advocates of a strong monarchy. They believed that loyalty to the king was the best way to ensure the protection of their faith. Theologians at Saumur developed theories justifying the toleration of multiple faiths to maintain public peace. When Louis XIV took personal control of the government in 1661, the treatment of Huguenots became harsher. Commissions were set up to investigate the legitimacy of the kingdom's churches, and many were ordered to close. Laws were passed to limit the access of Protestants to guilds and professions, and to chip away at the legal protections granted by the Edict of Nantes. a special fund was created in 1676 to provide economic assistance to Huguenots who converted to Catholicism. The most hated rule reduced the age of legal majority for religious decisions to 7, allowing Protestant children above that age to be taken from their families and raised in Catholic religious houses. In 1681, the intendant of Poitou discovered that the most effective way to win converts was to billet royal dragoons in Protestant households, where they would consume the family's resources until the family forswore their faith. The survival of Reformed baptismal registers allows for a precise tracking of the fate of France's churches. At the beginning of the 17th century, the Huguenots had about 930,000 members. By 1681, this number had dropped to about 700,000. Despite increased persecution in the 1660s and 1670s, the decline slowed. Some of the drop was due to conversions to Catholicism, but much of it was due to demographic factors, such as the negative reproduction rates in urban areas where the Huguenots were concentrated. The Huguenots remained loyal to their faith over 3 generations, even as their leading aristocratic champions defected and their protections and privileges were lost. The social composition of the Huguenot community changed, with merchants and manufacturers becoming more prominent in the leading circles of the faith. This change was not due to any special affinity between Reformed belief and business success, but rather to the political disadvantages faced by the Huguenots and the types of opportunities available to them. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685 marked a turning point in the history of the Huguenots. The revocation led to increased persecution, and many Huguenots were forced to flee France, while others converted to Catholicism to avoid persecution. The Huguenots who remained in France faced severe restrictions on their worship and daily lives, and their numbers continued to decline. Despite these challenges, the Huguenots' legacy lived on, and their influence can still be seen in various aspects of French culture and society. The story of the Huguenots, the French Protestants, is a powerful tale of faith, resistance, and the quest for freedom. For over 2 decades, King Louis XIV had been chipping away at the rights of the Huguenots, who had been protected by the Edict of Nantes since 1598. This edict, signed by Henry IV, allowed the Huguenots to practice their religion freely. However, Louis XIV, eager to show his support for the Catholic Church and to strengthen his own power, decided to revoke the Edict of Nantes in October 1685. Louis XIV had several reasons for this decision. His reputation as a Christian king had been damaged by his failure to help defend Vienna against the Ottoman Turks and by conflicts with the Pope over his right to appoint bishops. He wanted to prove his commitment to Catholicism by taking a strong stand against the Huguenots. In the months leading up to the revocation, his troops, known as dragoons, were sent to Huguenot areas to force conversions. Many Huguenots, fearing for their lives, converted to Catholicism, though often under duress. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes was a carefully planned operation. Huguenot churches were demolished, and their pastors were given a choice: convert to Catholicism and receive a pension, or leave the country. Ordinary Huguenots were not allowed to emigrate, but many found ways to escape. About 200,000 Huguenots fled France, settling in countries like the Netherlands, England, Switzerland, and even as far as South Africa. This exodus was one of the largest migrations for religious reasons in history. The Huguenots, who stayed in France, faced a difficult life. Many of the new converts, known as new converts, continued to practice their Protestant faith in secret. They gathered in isolated areas to pray and sing psalms, and some even formed small resistance groups. In the Cévennes region, a group called the Camisards, led by young prophets, fought a guerrilla war against the French army from 1702 to 1704. Eventually, the Camisards were granted amnesty, but the resistance showed the depth of the Huguenots' commitment to their faith. The Huguenot diaspora had significant impacts beyond France. Many of the refugees were skilled artisans, merchants, and professionals, and they contributed to the economic growth of the countries where they settled. For example, they played a crucial role in the development of the silk industry in the Netherlands and England. But perhaps the most lasting impact was ideological. Huguenot writers like Pierre Bayle and Jean Leclerc wrote influential works that promoted religious tolerance and criticized the intolerance of Louis XIV. Their ideas helped shape the Enlightenment, a period of intellectual and cultural growth in Europe. Despite the revocation, the Huguenots in France did not disappear. They continued to meet in secret, forming a Church of the Desert. In 1715, Antoine Court, a lay preacher, organized the first provincial synod of the Huguenots in the Cevennes. Over the next few decades, the Huguenots re-established their church structure, even though they had to meet in secret. By the time of the French Revolution in 1789, the Huguenots were once again legally allowed to practice their faith. At that point, there were about 500,000 Huguenots in France, a small but significant minority. The story of the Huguenots is a reminder of the power of faith and the human spirit. Despite the efforts of a powerful king to suppress them, the Huguenots maintained their identity and contributed to the world in meaningful ways. Their legacy lives on in the countries where they settled, and in the ideas of religious tolerance that they helped to spread. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes may have been a display of Louis XIV's power, but it also demonstrated the resilience and enduring strength of the human spirit.